Before I can talk about why Drakengard 3's final boss is one of the most fascinating gaming experiences I've ever had the pleasure of enduring, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. Just how many people hate this boss and believe it's the worst thing ever. If you look up what people have said about it, most of the time they'll say it's absolutely terrible or a prime example of what many call bad game design. With the release of Nier Replicant's remake this year, I thought now would be a good time to reflect on Drakengard 3's most contentious moment, as well as consider the implications of the overwhelming negative response to such a beautiful piece of art. Before all that, I want to first sincerely consider what the term bad game design means. I've seen game design, good game design in particular, in the most general sense characterized as a system, mechanic, or even narrative moment that positively contributes to the overall experience, usually by way of an alignment between a player's expectations and delivering on those expectations. When people talk about bad game design, generally it often refers to some element or segment of game mechanics that wasn't properly set up and doesn't contribute to the whole package. In a way, the practice bottlenecks the game's greatness because its systems or narrative become hampered by this design, even if the bad bits are self-contained. I want to be clear, Drakengard 3 is by no means a flawless experience. It can be overly repetitive and often performs terribly, all the while looking quite bad, but ironically that describes a bulk of the gameplay experience which the final boss completely breaks away from. Those who say Drakengard 3's final boss is bad often don't feel that the mechanics of the battle were set up previously, as well as thinking the entire premise is bullshit. However, when the rest of the game's mechanics are mediocre, is that such a bad thing? And trust me, this is coming from someone who loves the game enough to platinum it. A real example of bad game design I'd like to offer is having a bunch of useless activities in an open world game with a serious and seemingly time-constrained plot. It affects the game's pacing when the player unlocks story content every 3 or 4 hours unless they go out of their way to avoid everything the game is throwing at them. For a game's very pressing story to resolve anywhere from 8 to 100 hours later while you collect butterflies destroys any tension the story had, because it implicitly informs the player that the regional conflict will not progress without their agency, and the game is willing to let that conflict ferment indefinitely should the player choose not to actively participate. At least that's my argument, as someone who is particularly sensitive to the interplay between the game's narrative plot and the narrative derived from the moment-to-moment gameplay. While Drakengard 3 as a whole isn't perfect in this regard, I'd say the last battle gets as close as I could have hoped. Still, there's a bigger problem with games than bad game design, and that's ubiquitous game design. The gaming community at large talks about video games as if there is any meaningful amount of objectivity to be gained from them. Go online and on any analytical video there will be a mention either in the analysis itself or in the comments mentioning objectivity or lack thereof. Reviewers get flack a lot of the time for not being objective enough in their analysis, which makes no sense to me. While this piece isn't meant to be a treatise on artistic subjectivity, it's important to address my perspective on the matter since it gives a better understanding of how my mind processes Drakengard 3's final battle. Analysis is inherently subjective, as it is an individual's interpretation of their experience with a game or any other work of art. Patricia Taxon has a wonderful video on the notion of objective art criticism, which I recommend everyone watch. With acknowledging the subjectivity of interpretation, no one is making a claim that that experience will be your own, but it also lets you consider the possibilities and implications of that experience. Many players may defer to what the creators have to say about their work to support the idea of creator intent as a meaningful indicator of the game itself, but there's more to this interaction than we give credit. While we may be able to see what a developer is referencing when they make claims about their games, it does not mean their words are the only way to interpret what we experience when we play. For example, if a game has a sequence that is quite minimal in execution, a player can take that shift to mean we are supposed to view that moment as an abstract representation of what happens. The developers might come out and say they created it that way due to time and budget constraints, but that does not change the validity of that player's interpretation. While we can obtain valuable information from developer commentary and notes, their comments are not the totality of a game's offering. As much as gamers want to say games are art and worthy of critique and analysis afforded to other mediums, there is a strong push against giving up the objectivity that a toy or tool would have, which is an attitude we're better left abandoning. While there is nothing inherently wrong with objectivity, the practice of forcing objectivity leads to formulas for good games, good more so meaning financially and critically viable rather than any assessment of personal quality, which then influences the types of games that publishers feel comfortable making. And to bring it all back, these formulas in good games become ingrained in players, and that's what bad game design really means: mechanics or choices that are not formulaic or that fail to present themselves in formulaic ways. Such mechanics run the risk of alienating the majority of players, but that in and of itself should not be enough for critics to label it as bad. We can still learn something from transgressive art. While I'd love to refer exclusively to Drakengard 3 in this video, the sad truth is that there is not enough critical analysis to thoroughly dissect and work with, so forgive me for using this deficit to instead look at one of my other favorite games, The Last Guardian. Though this game is also critically underrated, there's more within this conversation to work with. Many people talk about Trico's behavior as bad game design because it is often unpredictable and doesn't respond to the player instantly. The lack of predictability means, as the problem suggests, that it makes it hard for players to know what their actions will do before Trico follows through. That Trico doesn't respond instantly leaves a lot of downtime, as well as leaving players unsure if they're approaching the right solution to a puzzle. If you see these behaviors as bad game design, I want you to ask yourself why that is, to critically engage with your displeasure, and I'm sure you can come up with completely valid reasons that are rooted in your subjective preferences. In their written review on The Last Guardian, which has unfortunately been scrubbed off the internet, Jim Sterling parenthetically wrote, "I should remind you that purposefully bad game design is still bad game design. It's antagonizing not to have this creature respond, especially at a rate inferior to my own real-life dog." This approach they and so many others take to criticizing games is not the most productive form of discussing the art. In calling Trico's behavior purposefully bad game design, they never once assess why this antagonism, as they refer to it, in Trico's design is bad. If I were to try and extrapolate an argument, I would say the test it has on a player's patience goes over the line, to which we'd have to consider whose line, which of course is Jim's, and then we'd have to consider how Jim Sterling is a professional reviewer who is incentivized to process games as quickly as possible, which may make it so their threshold for patience and lethargic experiences may not necessarily reflect your own. But we never get there in their review. Like I said, this entire discussion is kept parenthetical to the rest of the piece when its value is anything but. That's what I mean when I say game design becomes formulaic. Critics make broad statements about games that tell players what is good will work and what is bad will never work. Of course, that is not true. There are times where it does work, and those times will have people for and against those choices. In The Last Guardian, I believe the game's most positive aspects are the ones Jim Sterling finds annoying. For the record, neither of us are wrong, and that's the beauty of subjective criticism. We make claims and offer arguments, but ultimately the viewer and the audience gets to decide which argument is more sound. Even then, that doesn't invalidate that subjective experience that one had. If I have you in agreement so far, let me try and alienate you with another opinion. The only objectivity to be found in video games is in its code and specifications. That's all. The animations, numerical values, textures, models, resolution, frame rate, etc. are the only components of a game that are objective. However, what we say about any of those components beyond saying they exist, or descriptive claims like the resolution of said textures, is entirely subjective. Say you agree with that notion. Great! But now I want to use it against one of the common things you'll hear. Most would argue that 60 FPS is objectively better than 30 FPS, but that's not necessarily true. You can value the smoothness of a video game and prioritize low input latency, but not every player has to prefer smooth gameplay. That might sound stupid, but there are people who prefer 30 FPS. Regardless of whether it's because they are unfamiliar with 60 FPS, that doesn't change their preference, and since preference is subjective, that does not mean they're wrong. Objectively speaking, 60 FPS has more frames per second than 30 FPS, but that's all we can objectively say. And if it isn't obvious already, that doesn't make a substantial claim about a game. What does say more is how we feel about that fact, because of how different opinions can range on the topic. Well, should range, anyhow, because unfortunately the search for objectivity and opinion within video games leads to a community of critics and viewers who all seek to have the right opinion because objectivity necessitates a correct answer. In the search of a right opinion, we create concepts like bad game design, which limits how much developers are willing to experiment in their games out of fear of alienating their audience. Usually, but not with Drakengard 3. Not at all. Now I can finally get into this masterpiece. If you haven't played Drakengard 3, including Branch D, I hesitantly highly recommend everyone do so. I understand not everyone owns a PS3 or a computer powerful enough to emulate the game, so it's difficult for me to encourage everyone to go out and acquire either of those things solely for the purpose of playing Drakengard 3's ending. But deep down I still want to do exactly that. It's a breathtaking experience that goes against everything conventional game design tells you to do. The rest of this analysis assumes some knowledge of the game, so keep that in mind if references to certain aspects of the game are glossed over. If you don't plan to play it or you are not bothered with being spoiled, stick around while I gush over one of my favorite gameplay moments, period. This ending might come across as an interesting looking rhythm game if you haven't played it. If it makes you feel any better, most people who play through the game see it the same way. Drakengard 3 is an action RPG with hack and slash combat which isn't really fun or performs very well. Seriously, sometimes this game goes below 20 FPS or outright freezes for seconds. Regardless of my take on the combat, it makes sense to expect the game to end with a battle using the mechanics the game has taught you throughout. After all, the player even has to obtain every weapon before unlocking Branch D, so to not utilize those weapons would be silly. Yet that's exactly what Drakengard 3 does. If watching the battle seems confusing, imagine playing it. There are no button prompts, nothing telling the player what to press, when to press, or how their actions work relative to the rings emanating from the intoner's mouth. I died several times on the first sister before realizing what was going on. Most die as soon as the first ring comes out, because there's no way to tell on a first go what you're supposed to do. It's not a typical rhythm game in that you press the button when the notes come out. It's more like a rhythmic version of Simon Says, where the player has to hit the notes on the same beats on the next measure of the song. It's kind of a response of sorts. The battle relies more so on the player's ability to internalize the progressively difficult rhythm than it is on what the player sees. Visual cues are constant in games, as most games teach us to rely on responding to what we see more than what we hear. This isn't to say no game has audio cues, in fact many do, but it'd be a lie to say most games rely on sound the same way they do sight, which is a shame because sound can impart just as much to a scene's emotion as the visuals do. Nothing says this to the player quite like the obtuse camera angles which give an unorthodoxly pleasing view of the action on display. Many people complain about the camera movement, but it is only bad if you believe the camera is supposed to aid you in this battle. And I don't blame people for making that assumption, but it's still an assumption. The visuals aren't designed to help, but the music is, and the camera's apathy or outright antagonism toward the player is the game's way of nudging you to focus less with your eyes and more with your ears. This isn't to say that the player should close their eyes when they play. The camera also adds to the emotional weight. There are specific moments I want to look at where the camera work adds to the scene. The end of 3's segment closes in on her face while the player, out of sight, must still respond to the rings. There is no visual way for the player to know when to block the ring. Someone can call this a troll moment that is meant to mess with you, but it marks the player's insignificance in their scale and action to the sisters. That's what tends to upset players about the ending, how small and out of center they are to the whole action. We also see this earlier during 5's segment where towards the end the camera zooms out to such a level where it is hard to locate Mikhail. And yet, during scenes like at the end of 2's segment, it ends with a close-up of Mikhail's face, a choice which is equally as unhelpful to the player. However, rather than acknowledging a minuscule defense, we get to see Mikhail's stern and determined expression, which instantly conveys the weight of his defense and how much he has grown throughout his journey during a battle where you're right there with him. It was at this moment of intimacy with our avatar that, honestly, I shed a tear the first time I got there, because you're feeling that exact same nervousness and anxiety, and I also couldn't believe that the madman actually went and did it. Like, seriously, Square Enix actually let the team do this as a final battle. This would be a widely experimental and avant-garde experience coming from anywhere, but the fact that Square Enix's name is on the box makes the whole thing feel even more taboo. Like, there's no way anyone but Yosuke Saito saw it and thought it was releasable. The song poses a seemingly insurmountable challenge not only for Mikhail but the player as well, because one hit and the player must restart the whole battle from the very beginning. This is an 8-minute battle where one missed note 7 minutes in requires you to do it all over again. Now, of course, this is no doubt bad game design, except it isn't. Let's say there were checkpoints. How would that play out or change the way the final battle happens? Well, for one, the battle's tension would decrease dramatically if you could die and be at the sister who you just died to, brute forcing through that one section and so on and so forth. Even if there was one checkpoint halfway, it would still have the same negative effect with less convenience for the player. Also, for something that is supposed to signify the end of the world if there is even one mistake on Mikhail's part, it does the whole ordeal a disservice by not committing to the entirety of the battle. In actuality, I think this moment would have been all the more amazing if it permanently altered your game save if you failed even once, but for obvious reasons that is asking too much of the player. Breaking down the battle into checkpointed segments would have also ruined how it played out because it fragments each sister rather than bringing them all together, which is both visually and mechanically represented as the battle goes on. This is reinforced by having the player restart from the beginning despite how upsetting that might feel. The short, unskippable cutscene in the beginning is a part of this as well. That cutscene not only shows the start of the blooming flower, but is also the first indication of how the Japanese-inspired music is going to function throughout. It sets the tone for the battle and resets it after death. Does this come with some frustration? Absolutely, but why must frustration necessarily be a negative emotion in the context of what's happening in the game? You just failed to save the world. That should frustrate you. A lot of the emotions this final battle elicits are hard to deal with, as they should be given the narrative they're attached to. Your heart should be racing, your hands should shake, and your head should feel light. Not many games manage to achieve such emotional highs, let alone in such a short time. While others have argued this sentiment before, thematically it makes sense for a battle against characters who use songs as their main weapon to be a rhythm game. The game may disregard conventional design, but it doesn't do so solely to upset the player. To suggest that is to downplay the beauty and artistry on display in the closing moments of the game. If you honestly believe that Drakengard 3 would be a better game without that boss being what it is, then I'm not here to argue with you. I can only say that it was the most standout moment of the whole experience and worth trudging through everything else to get there. Even though mechanically the game may not have prepared me for it, the misdirection of that reality only makes that ending all the more potent in its delivery. Button prompts and tutorials would have only removed me and created another layer between me and what was on the screen. The HUD-less, tightly controlled sequence was the most connected I ever felt with the game, more connected than I feel with most other games too. It cut out all sense of abstraction that occurs when playing a game where systems and mechanics determine a player's role. While obviously that wasn't entirely gone in those final playable moments, all I had to think about was the music, my own sense of rhythm, and that damn black flower.
いつの日かゼロがもう一度私の前に現れるそんな気がしてなりません私に見えるのは遠い遠い過去の淵私
I hope you found my case for the beauty of artistic subjectivity, unconventional game design, and Drakengard 3's final boss compelling. If not, I want you to know that that's fine too. Again, everything we say worth discussing is an exertion of our personal preferences and willingness to see an experience from as many angles as our brains can tolerate. I hope whoever makes it through this piece leaves their notion of bad game design, I'm putting air quotes there, in the past and realizes that nothing can forever be cast in that light. Just because there hasn't been a game that has convinced you a certain mechanic can both be good and bad depending on the context of its use, doesn't mean you should close yourself off to that possibility. I encourage everyone to enjoy as many games as they can for what they offer and critically engage with how they offer it, rather than run through the gymnastics of viewing them solely in comparison to what you already know. I think if more people did that, it would widen the scope of the sorts of interactive experiences we find worthwhile, which I think is something we can all get behind.
じゃあまたいつかそれじゃあ本当にありがとうございました。